Alrighty, next up is Bill Thar. And many of us know Bill Thar as the Duck Hawk guy and former president of ACA. But he's a very, very capable ridge pilot. Has flown many years in an assortment of eclectic gliders like PW5s and LAC 12s and Sparrowhawks and the Duck Hawk. He just seems to always have a funny glider when he's flying. But in taking his gliders, I think one of his more impressive flights was a 750K triangle with hardly any turns at all. And he will, in his olden days, he used to be an epidemiologist and a doctor of sorts, and he was really into statistics, and he has some interesting statistics to share in terms of understanding and approaching ridge flying, and he'll talk about the kind of preparation things that you need to do to be successful in ridges. So, give a round of applause to Bill.
Thank you, Daniel. I guess I have the privilege of being the last speaker. That means you're out of here after me. I guess that's the most optimistic part of it. But what I really want to leave with you is a message about how to put a lot of this information together in a program that will actually get you to where you want to be in flying the ridges. And what we're talking about is a more systematic approach. When I first learned to fly ridges back, not that many years ago actually, I did it by what I call the Braille method. You just fly around on the home ridge and then you sort of feel out a little bit further on each flight until you learn it. But I think we've come a long way since my early days and a lot of our early days to the point where you should really think about how you're going to organize your approach to getting where you want to go in terms of ridge flying, how to put together a real program. And the Aero Club Albatross, ACA, has done this more formally in its ridge guidelines by trying to spell out a program for approaching ridge soaring so that at least you touch all the bases, you cover all the pieces of information that you've really seen here today. You've gotten an introduction to the facts about ridge soaring today. This is really important. So you begin to build your knowledge base. Now you need to begin to apply this over and over again in practical situations where you can really ingrain these skills into your flying and into your flying technique. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So really talking about, are you really ready to fly ridges? You understand what the risks are. There's been a lot of discussion of risk today, and I'm actually going to talk a little bit more about risk in a quantitative way. Daniel said that I was an epidemiologist and a physician, and I'm interested in statistics, so I've actually put together some numbers around this as well. How do we get started? Learn the basics. This is really the beginning of it. Coming to the session is how you begin to learn the basics. How do you move on from there? How do you expand your horizons and really move out from basic principles? And of course, we all think about the big one, that 750K triangle or that 500K out and return. How do we really get to the point where we feel comfortable and are going to be able to manage the risks around that kind of flight? So it's really a progression that we're looking at. So are you ready to really manage the risk? We often get in this conversation when we talk about soaring with people who are not soaring pilots. You've had that conversation where you mention that, yeah, I fly gliders, and they say, you fly gliders? Isn't that dangerous? So what's your response to them?
Fly great without an engine.
What was that?
Regular airplanes are like bricks without a motor. You fly awesome without a motor.
I always
Right.
say, no chance of engine fire.
No chance of engine fire. Well, I think we all try to mitigate the risk when we talk about flying gliders to others. But, you know, in fact, when you listen to what you've heard today and understand what's involved, you understand that flying gliders is actually dangerous. It is dangerous. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't fly gliders, obviously. We're all going to do this. And I've actually gone back and said, as an epidemiologist, I should be able to calculate the risks involved in flying gliders. And the best comparison is a kind of hour-for-hour comparison between, say, something we do every day, like driving a car. And Bruno Gottenberg, years ago, had this speech. He said, he was talking about, everyone says it's more dangerous to drive to the airport than to fly the airplane or the glider as you get there, which was totally untrue, he said. Well, as you really look at it, and you can actually get a good idea of what the risk comparison is, flying gliders is somewhere between 10 and 25 times more dangerous hour per hour than driving a car. 10 to 25 times dangerous. That means if driving a car for drivers, this is just for drivers, not passengers. If everyone had the same risk as glider pilots driving cars, we would kill between 200 and 400,000 people a year in automobile accidents. So that just gives you an idea what the real numbers are. So let's look at where this risk lies in terms of other sports. It's more dangerous than hang gliding, skydiving, boxing, scuba diving, U.S. football, motorbike racing, canoeing, swimming, running, bicycling, bungee jumping, snowboarding, skiing, flying home-built aircraft, and mountain climbing. It's more dangerous than all of those kind of sports. It's certainly more dangerous than the safe sports that were demonstrated early. So what risk category does it belong in? It's about the same as mountain climbing in Nepal. Not just any mountains. We had mountain climbing up here. It's the same as base jumping, you know, where these nuts jump off the side of cliffs with parachutes and wingsuits. And Grand Prix racing in Formula One cars. So that's the category of risk we're in as just plain glider pilots. So it is a dangerous sport. Flying gliders is dangerous, and as we've heard several times, we're not only flying gliders, we're flying them on the ridge. So it's flying in high winds and turbulence. We've heard all this, high speeds, close to rocks and trees, doing high demand maneuvers. It's physically demanding, bumping around, it's cold, it's freezing, you know, all of these things. But what I'm here to say is the danger is manageable. That is, Cookie gave a very good chart. I think that was a really good introduction on the risk comparison, your skill versus the risk. That says we can manage the risk. So flying gliders doesn't have to be dangerous to you personally if you know how to manage the risk. And that's what this is all about. This whole process is about learning how to manage the risk, learning how to develop your skill level so it always exceeds the risk level that you're going to accept. So that's really the bottom line. So how do we start? Well, the ACA guidelines put it really in a kind of a simple three-step process. So first, learn the basics. And part of that is mastering knowledge. That's what you're doing today. You're getting all the information you need to get the cognitive piece of putting this together. All the information you need to learn how the ridge works, what you need to deal with, what you need to learn. You need to have that knowledge base. We looked at basics, looking at your own personal limitations. I mean, how far do you want to take this? Is your goal really a 1,000K triangle, or is it just to have fun on a nice afternoon flying the local ridge? Know the rules of the ridge. Read about them, and those are going to be different for every location. Know your own glider. We've heard that over and over again. You need to know how your glider flies in all different kinds of conditions. You need to know the ridge environment itself, what's available, the landing areas, the shape of the ridge. Everything, again, that you've heard today is critical to building that basic knowledge base. And most critical, and a part of the ACA guidelines and your personal guidelines, is finding a mentor or mentors. You need to have someone who can check your progress and make sure that you're moving along every one of the steps to become a really qualified glider pilot. So part of that basics is really picking out, first of all, a safe home ridge to practice. That's where you're going to learn your basics. It doesn't have to be a long stretch. You know, basically for Aero Club Albatross, it goes from the Delaware water gap to what we call the Millbrook power lines in the Millbrook Valley. It's a short piece of ridge. It has some variation in it, has an adequate, escape route and landing fields in the valley, in the Delaware Valley. And it has even some mild transition space in it between a little front ridge and rear ridge. But it provides a very protected local space to learn a lot. I can't remember how many hours I spent flying between Millbrook and Delaware water gap. I remember I launched several days where I had to launch early in the morning to avoid the winds, and I couldn't land until the evening because it was too rough to land. So I was up there for hours, just flying back and forth, back and forth. And that's not just boring work, because every time you fly back and forth, you pick a different position. You fly a different route. You test out a different way of positioning yourself on the winds. You see exactly, as the wind changes through the day, how it reacts differently. You're beginning to develop what's called situational awareness. And we'll talk more about that because that's critical. That's the thing, you call Bobby Templin for. Here's, the built-in sensor for situational awareness on the ridge. You ask Bobby how the ridge is working, he'll tell you exactly how it is. And when you go down on the ridge and test it, it will be exactly the way he told you it would be. So that's the kind of situational awareness that you're going to have to develop as a pilot. So you need to train with your mentor on the home ridge until that mentor or mentors really sign you off and say, okay, you're ready to move on. I also recommend, even early on, you've got to use some kind of tracking system, preferably a satellite tracking system, because a lot of our ridges are out of cell tower range. And you should begin to use it even on the local ridge. We know from our own experience of pilots going down that you can be lost 6 miles from the airport, or even off the airport anywhere. You don't have to be 100 miles away to be lost. When you fall down through those trees, you're not visible anymore. And unless we know exactly where you are, which is what you're going to get from a satellite tracking system, we're not going to find you. Or we may not find you until it's too late. People often talk about, packing up survival gear. I often say survival gear is what you use when people can't find you. the most important gear for your survival on any glider flight, and especially ridge flights, is the equipment that's going to allow someone else to find you. So remember that. So one of your first purchases, if you don't have one already, is a satellite tracker. Spot, InReach, 406, personal locator. One of the satellite tracking system that is GPS enabled. The old 125.5 system is really out of date. So, of course, the important thing about that basics part, as I mentioned, is practicing. How do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. How do you get to Hawk Mountain? Practice, practice, practice. Practice, as I mentioned, ridge positions. Thermaling off the ridge, you've heard a lot about that today. Figure eights, transition to full circles. These are basic kinds of flight maneuvers that you have to not only be familiar with, you have to perfect. You can't just be familiar with them and move on. You have to perfect each of these maneuvers because, again, you're doing this within a couple hundred feet of rocks and trees. These are not things that you would do even in a landing pattern, as Carl mentioned earlier on. We're doing a lot of very risky maneuvers very close to the ground, very close to things that are hard and will kill us. As we saw here before with Cookie's presentation, you have to master off-field landing. I often say flying the ridge is flying the world's longest base leg. You turn right or left and land, basically. So this is something that has to be natural to you. You have to know how to do off-field landings as though they were second nature. And these are all things you master while you're flying the home ridge. So this little home ridge portion of it is really quite complex, involved, and really involves a high level of mastery before you move on from that level. It means you have to master all these basic skills because these are the skills you're going to use as you move out on the ridge. So we've had, yeah.
I flew with Cookie one time. I don't think it's been emphasized how closely you follow the shape
Oh, yeah.
of the ridge.
Right, well, we're talking about, one wingspan up and one wingspan out from the ridge in the sweet spot. So yes, if you look at someone who's following the ridge on a high-speed day, they are literally following the landscape of the ridge, and you see that as they fly it. So, Steve, wake up. I'm calling on you because you're a person who's really gone through this process of really mastering working on the local ridge. What do you think really have been the most important parts of going through this?
Okay, well, to just introduce myself, I'm new to gliding relatively. I've only been soaring since 2016 and joined ACA at that time. And by the end of 2016 is where I flew my first solo ridge flight. And from that point on, I went forward trying to get badges, etc. So that's my perspective. And the most important part for me was having a good mentor, who was Daniel, who still is, and having a structured program was also very, very important. So the first goal was to feel very comfortable on the local ridge, like Bill said, and there was some minimum number of local flights that were needed on the ridge, or local hours, I guess, spent on the local ridge. But as it ended up being, it was mostly time spent in calendar time. And I think that makes a huge difference, because as the seasons change, the ridge behaves very differently. Everything there is different. The tree foliage is different. Just the whole characteristic changes. The ridge also isn't just a single ridge, it's actually a double ridge. Depending on the wind, we have both northwest and southeast. And that's something that's really amazing and magical, just like a lot of things in ACA, and, or Blairstown. And having a chance to fly the southeast ridge several times during that period also made a huge difference, because there, you're allowed to fly right through the water gap, even though you're just on the local ridge, because the definition of local is different for the southeast. So that really expanded my horizon. I also flew some thermal flights beyond the water gap, and that also made a big difference. I also had my silver badge by that point, and that also made a difference, giving more confidence being away from home, so to speak. So all these things added up, and I ended up, I think, having maybe almost 2 full seasons of local ridge flying before I ventured beyond the water gap on the northwest side on my own. And I think that made a huge, huge difference, because by the time I went past the water gap, I already felt I knew everything, pretty much. Because let me mention just a few more things that I think helped me a lot. First of all, condor flying. I think I got into that late in the game, much after I started gliding, soaring. I mean, to the real condor. I played with Microsoft before that. And I think it makes a huge, huge difference, okay, flying on condor, because especially nowadays, where one of our guys, Sergey, has done a really good job setting up the scenery for the Blairstown area, all the way down to the Tuscarora. You can really do a lot of ridge flying on condor and get to be very comfortable on condor, and it transfers incredibly well into real life, from my experience. So that's also very, very important, getting a lot of condor time. Let's see, what else? So I mentioned the thermal flying on the ridge. It was a ridge day. The one day I did, it was not a super strong ridge day, but my goal was to try to go down the ridge on thermals, and I believe I got to ski area, and I only came back because it was a very cold day. So that also made a huge difference doing thermaling along the ridge. So by the time I actually went past the water gap, as I said, I felt very comfortable, and it was almost a no-brainer.
You studied the natural landouts.
Yeah, yes, certainly all the landouts. I think let me mention a couple of other things that are very critical, or were very critical to me. Okay, one was OLC, and the other was, these are resources that are at our disposal that weren't there a few years ago. So OLC is one. Another one is called The Ridge. It's a website that's mostly done by Daniel, and it tells you everything you ever wanted to know. I don't think it's been even mentioned today, but I think this is like the jewel, really, the crown jewel of everything we have, and all the ridge knowledge pretty much is concentrated into that one website, one map, a Google map that,
Daniel's going to talk more about it.
yeah, I guess Daniel's going to talk about it, but it hasn't been talked about yet. It has basically all the knowledge, every tiny little piece of real estate, whether it's a hot spot, where somebody crashed, where somebody landed out, everything is in there, and you really want to know that inside out. And OLC is, as you know, the online contest which retains the flight logs or traces of pretty much every flight since, I believe, 2007 or so. So quite a few years going back. So we have a lot of experts in our club, and all their flights, it's not just that you hear about them on the deck. You can go to OLC, download their logs, and look how they flew, almost inch by inch, second by second, and exactly which way they took. You could figure out the wind based on their thermaling, so you could pretty much know more or less what kind of a day it was. And this allows you as a newbie, to learn how other people flew. So that's all critical, in my opinion, to going forward, let's say beyond the water gap. So that's it in short, or long.
Complete.
So, you can, again, Steve just pointed out how important this learning the basics is. Practicing on your home ridge stretch, which is a place that you picked out, specifically to learn these basics. It makes all the difference. I wish I would have had, that kind of experience. It would have really accelerated my learning. We talk, again, a lot about situational awareness, and this time that you spend on the home ridge builds your situational awareness. Your situational awareness is the thing that automatically tells you the ridge is starting to weaken. The ridge is strong. This next corner is going to be a problem. I'm too low on the ridge. My position is off. I can't make this field. I can make that one. These are all the things that come out of situational awareness, and situational awareness is something that you build by flying and looking out the window. It gets burned into your brain after a while until you're able to look out and know exactly where you are, what's happening, how the wind is blowing, how far you can go, where you can land and where you can't, where it's going to be turbulent and where it's not. All of these things are a part of situational awareness, and you learn them all on this little stretch of ridge, going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth.
Also memory.
So moving on, expanding your scope, I think, Steve already mentioned a part of this. Part of expanding your scope is really just applying those skills to newer sections of the ridge. And of course, one of the big parts of this that Steve alluded to is part of the planning process. I'm going to ask Daniel to talk more about that in a moment, because I think he's developed one of the most thorough, comprehensive planning processes I've ever seen for ridge soaring. But we'll talk about that in a bit. And learning new ridge skills, ridge transitions. You heard about those from Jonathan, how to cross gaps, how to cross weak areas on the ridge, reading changes in the ridge itself. So how do you actually go beyond that and really plan for the big one, your 500K out and return, or your 750 triangle after you've developed all these skills? Well, first of all, this is not the only time you use these planning methods. You're actually using them for every single ridge flight that you make. Right? Requires thorough preparation of your pilot, of the glider itself, your understanding of the geography you're flying in, the weather systems that you're going to be flying, and what your support systems are for that flight. So they're all big flights. Every ridge flight is a big flight. We prepare through pilot and mentor briefings. And it's one of the best ways. But there's a lot of new technology out here, and there's a more comprehensive system of preparing for flight. So Daniel, you want to talk about that a bit?
Sure. So, kind of going into that, I figured I'd start off with, a thought or question, right? So, how many people here had flown 50 hours last year? Raise your hand.
Exactly.
Or over 50 hours or more, right? How many people flew more than 100 hours? More than 150?
Glider only?
Well, okay. I flew about 180, right? And that probably sounds like a lot, right? Well, so let's say that you were a professional swimmer, and when you said that I went and I swam for 50 hours last year,
or, you know, let's say we're, well, not even professional, and we can say, well, I swam for 50 hours. You know, people would hardly take you seriously, right? I mean, if you said I spent 50 hours on a basketball court, you know, you would hardly be able to play a pickup game, right? And yet, and the nature of flying is that flying tends to be expensive, and you have to do it in very particular times and things like that. So we really don't have a lot of opportunity to practice. I fly 180 hours, and that's not a lot. I mean, for a professional, you know, for an athlete, you'd want to do a lot more than that, but we're constrained. However, the nice thing about flying is that you can go and you can milk out every ounce of experience that you get. So if you go and you look at your own tracks, if you look at the weather, if you make the predictions, you can go and make sure that every hour that of flying that you did, that you'll learn every bit of that you can get out of it. So that's why it's nice to look at your log and things like that and see you and such. But the other thing is, especially for ridge flying, is that it is technical. And technical means that there's a lot to it. There's a lot of things that happen. There's a lot of knowledge. Now, the nice thing is that we have, you know, I had the benefit of having people like Carl and Schwartz and Bobby and Bill and Jonathan and Cookie that they've already done, they already figured out the routes. They already figured out where the landing options are. They already figured out where all the places that you can get into trouble. And so when you look at it, well, see, when you talk to these guys, they'll tell you where not to go. So don't go there. You know, and some of the tools like the ridge map, they actually do that more explicitly. Now, for the much bigger flights or the kind of the planning that goes into the things that I'm interested in, I principally look at the weather and I look at the landing options along the way. And so Cookie talked about, you know, my propensity for trying to find every field along a section of ridge. And the idea there is that, well, when you're in let's say we're at the water gap or we're at some tricky spot, you look out ahead, it may look like a sea of trees out there, but I want to know exactly where the next field is. Now, if I'm going into an unlandable area, I don't want to know exactly how far unlandable it is. I'd much rather, like, going to an unlandable area for 2 minutes is not remotely as bad as going to an unlandable area for 10 minutes. So I want to know exactly where the landing option is. And then next is, given the landing option, I want to know what my approach is going to be into it. So maybe by knowing, out in the distance I can see a little bit of a clearing, and I looked at the map before, I've studied it, and I know that I have to make an approach in a particular way. And so I know that now I've got it made. Whereas, if I didn't do the preparation, then that wouldn't be the case. Now, to get a sense as to what's the scale of preparation, and this is, you know, and obviously once you've done it, then it gets easier, and then you can build on past experience. But the ratio that I've discussed with some of my fellow junior pilots out in Europe and such is it's about 9 to 1. I'll let that sink in. For every hour of ridge flying, or every, you know, that's what it takes in the beginning in terms of combat practice and CU and looking at weather. It doesn't feel like it because it's fun to do that, you know. But that is the degree, you know, that's what goes into that. And like over the past winter, I've been working out a route up north. You know, maybe if I'm so lucky, I'll be able to fly up, you know, up into Vermont this year. And you know, I easily spent about 50 hours over the span of, you know, a couple months working out the route. You know, and but the nice thing is, you can do that at home. You know, you can do that, you know, in the comfort of your favorite chair, right? And that's how you learn. Now, Bill, so I'll let you make your concluding thoughts.
Okay.
What's that?
That thing, I thought you were
I did. I mentioned it.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we'll share it later.
So anyway, I think you understand how much work goes into preparation for safe ridge flight. It's not a walk in the park by any means, and nor is soaring. You know, we all came to soaring through pretty rigorous training just to learn how to fly the damn thing. But now we're talking about actually going somewhere and going somewhere using a very unique kind of propulsion, something known as ridge flight. So which is essentially surfing the ridge, you know, at almost a wing's length distance from rocks and trees at high speeds in turbulence. Sounds like fun.
It is.
And it is. So, what do we have to say at the end of this? Well, my advice, sort of sage advice, is smart pilots learn from their mistakes. But wise pilots learn from others' mistakes.
Exactly.
And so that's what we're here. We're here to learn from everyone else's mistakes, what we need to know, so that we could really enjoy this sport and come back to the next seminar next year and talk about our experiences. Thank you all.
Well, folks, that wraps up our show. So give please a big round of applause for our presenters.